"You just destroyed the wrong woman's life," Diana Washington whispered, staring at the shredded remains of what used to be her passport. But those words would come later in a moment that would change everything. The alarm on Diana's phone buzzed softly at 4:30 a.m., cutting through the sterile silence of her modest hotel room near Chicago O'Hare. She didn't need the alarm anymore. After 20 years of federal service, her internal clock had calibrated itself to wake before dawn. But routines mattered in her line of work, especially when those routines kept you invisible to the people you were investigating. Diana Washington, 42 years old, and carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to command respect without demanding it, slipped out of bed and moved through her morning ritual with practiced precision. The hotel room was nothing special, a mid-tier chain that business travelers passed through without remembering, and that was exactly how Diana preferred it when she was working undercover. She unrolled her yoga mat on the thin carpet and moved through a series of poses that centered her mind and prepared her body for what could be a long day of standing, walking, and observing. The sun salutation felt like a prayer, a moment of peace before stepping into the storm of human behavior at its worst, because Diana had learned over the years that airports brought out both the best and worst in people, and her job was to document when the worst crossed legal boundaries. After her workout, Diana sat cross-legged on the bed with her laptop reviewing the thick digital file that had brought her to Chicago in the first place. The complaint had come through official channels, but the details were troubling enough that her supervisor had decided an undercover audit was necessary rather than the standard announced inspection that gave airlines time to hide their problems. The file painted a picture of Blake Patterson, a gate agent at Terminal 2 who seemed to have developed a pattern of treating certain passengers with a level of aggression that went far beyond normal customer service disputes. The complaints were specific enough to be credible, detailed enough to be concerning, and frequent enough to suggest that Phoenix Airlines either didn't know what was happening at Gate A7 or didn't care enough to stop it. Diana's phone rang, breaking her concentration, and she smiled when she saw the contact name. "Good morning, baby girl," she answered, her voice warming immediately. "Mom, I know it's early, but I couldn't sleep." Came the voice of Zara Washington, 18 years old and carrying the weight of college applications on her shoulders. "Did you get the essay I sent last night? The one for the aviation management program?" Diana leaned back against the headboard, feeling the familiar tug between her professional responsibilities and her role as a single mother. "I read it twice, and it's beautiful, Zara. You wrote about Grandpa James in a way that would make him proud, talking about how his work as an aircraft mechanic inspired your career goals." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Diana could picture her daughter sitting at her desk in their Arlington apartment, probably surrounded by college brochures and half-empty coffee cups. "Do you really think I can make a difference in aviation? Like actually change things so that people like Grandpa don't get fired for doing the right thing?" The question hit Diana in a place that still ached after all these years. Her father, James Washington, had been an aircraft mechanic for a major airline back in the 1980s, and when he'd discovered that supervisors were pressuring mechanics to sign off on incomplete repairs to keep planes on schedule, he'd reported it through proper channels. The airline's response had been swift and brutal. They'd found reasons to terminate him that had nothing to do with his whistleblowing, but everything to do with silencing him. "You can absolutely make a difference," Diana said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "The industry needs people who understand that safety isn't just about following regulations. It's about making sure that every person who steps onto an airplane gets to go home to their family. That's why Grandpa spoke up, and that's why I do what I do." After ending the call with promises to review Zara's other essays later that evening, Diana moved to the bathroom and began the most important part of her morning routine, becoming invisible. Her natural appearance was striking enough that people remembered her with high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, and the kind of presence that commanded attention in boardrooms and courtrooms. But today, Diana Washington, the federal inspector, needed to disappear so that she could become just another tired traveler trying to get from Chicago to Phoenix. She pulled her thick hair back into a simple ponytail, skipped the makeup that usually gave her face professional authority, and chose clothes that would make her blend into the background of any airport terminal. The worn jeans had been purchased specifically for undercover work, faded enough to suggest financial constraints comfortable enough for long hours of standing and walking. The oversized hoodie was a few years old, the kind that frequent travelers threw on for comfort rather than style, and the sneakers were practical rather than fashionable. Diana packed her government credentials deep in an inner pocket of her large tote bag, along with the ruggedized tablet that contained access to every safety database the Federal Aviation Administration maintained. Her cover story was simple and believable. She was visiting a sick aunt in Phoenix, had booked the cheapest ticket available, and was prepared to be the kind of passenger that gate agents dealt with every day without a second thought. The irony wasn't lost on her as she looked in the mirror one final time before leaving the hotel room. In a few hours, she would walk up to Blake Patterson's counter looking like exactly the kind of passenger that the complaints suggested he enjoyed intimidating, and he would have no idea that he was about to encounter someone with the power to end his career, fine his employer millions of dollars, and potentially shut down their operations at one of the busiest airports in the world. Diana gathered her things and headed for the door, carrying herself with the slightly stooped posture of someone trying to avoid attention rather than the confident stride that usually marked her movement through federal buildings. Today's performance would require her to absorb whatever Blake Patterson threw at her, while documenting every violation, every breach of dignity, every moment when his authority crossed the line from customer service into something darker. The elevator descended toward the lobby, and Diana felt the familiar pre-mission focus settling over her thoughts. She had spent years learning to make herself invisible to the people she investigated, but she had never forgotten the lesson her father had taught her in the months after he'd been fired for doing the right thing. "Baby girl," he'd said, sitting on their front porch while he looked through want ads that never seemed to lead anywhere. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people show you exactly who they are when they think nobody important is watching." Blake Patterson checked his reflection in the men's restroom mirror one final time before starting his shift, adjusting the gel in his platinum blonde hair until every strand fell exactly where he wanted it. At 35, Blake had cultivated an appearance that projected authority and control from the carefully maintained physique that strained against his Phoenix Airlines uniform to the jawline he kept clenched in what he imagined was an intimidating expression. The morning routine had become a ritual over the past 8 years, ever since he'd started working at O'Hare, and discovered that a gate agent position could be transformed into something much more powerful if you understood how to use the uniform, the computer access, and the inherent vulnerability of passengers who needed something from you. Blake had learned early that travelers were essentially hostages to the airline experience, dependent on gate agents for seat assignments, boarding passes, and, most importantly, the decision about whether they would be allowed to fly at all. It was intoxicating to hold that kind of power over people, to see the relief in their faces when he decided to help them, or the desperation when he chose to make their lives difficult. He practiced his intimidating stare in the mirror, the look that had become his signature move when dealing with passengers who didn't immediately defer to his authority. The expression had been perfected over years of interactions with people who thought they could argue their way into better seats, earlier boarding, or exceptions to policies that Blake enforced selectively based on his personal assessment of whether someone deserved his cooperation. The reflection staring back at him showed a man who had convinced himself that his position at Gate A7 represented real authority rather than the customer service job it actually was. But Blake had spent so many years building his identity around the power to control other people's travel plans that he'd forgotten the difference between respect and fear. His apartment that morning had been a reminder of the gap between Blake's self-image and his actual circumstances. The expensive downtown condo was stretching his budget to the breaking point, furnished with the kind of modern pieces that looked impressive but cost more than his Phoenix Airlines salary could realistically support. The credit card statements piling up on his kitchen counter told the story of a man living beyond his means to maintain an image that felt essential to his sense of self-worth. Amber had been on him again about their relationship timeline, pointing out that they'd been dating for 3 years and she was ready to start talking about engagement and marriage. But Blake knew that the kind of wedding Amber expected would cost more than he made in 6 months. The promotion to senior gate lead would come with a significant pay bump and better benefits, but the position required a clean record and positive performance reviews that Blake wasn't entirely sure he could maintain if anyone looked too closely at his customer service metrics. The walk from the employee restroom to Gate A7 took Blake through the bustling Terminal 2 concourse, and he moved with the swagger of someone who believed he owned the space around him. Other airline employees nodded respectfully as he passed, and Blake interpreted their acknowledgement as recognition of his status within the airport hierarchy, rather than the polite greetings they offered to any colleague. Gate A7 was his kingdom, a position he'd held longer than any other agent in the terminal, and Blake had organized the workspace to project maximum authority. The podium was arranged so that passengers had to look up at him when approaching the counter, and he kept his computer monitor angled so that travelers couldn't see what he was actually doing on the screen, maintaining the mystique of exclusive access to information they needed. Tiffany Rodriguez was already at the gate when Blake arrived, reviewing the passenger manifest for the morning's first flight to Phoenix. At 26, Tiffany was relatively new to the airline industry, and Blake had made it clear from her first day that her success at Gate A7 depended on following his lead and backing up his decisions without question. Morning Tiffany Blake said, settling into position behind the main podium with the territorial confidence of an alpha claiming his space. "Looks like we've got weather delays coming out of Denver, which means passengers are going to be cranky and looking for someone to blame. Remember what I taught you about managing expectations?" Tiffany nodded, though Blake's training had always made her uncomfortable. His approach to passenger service seemed designed to establish dominance rather than provide assistance, and she'd witnessed interactions that crossed the line from firm customer service into something that felt more like bullying. "Any VIPs on the manifest today?" Blake asked, scanning the computer screen for the frequent flyer status markers that indicated passengers who might have the connections to complain effectively about poor treatment. These were the travelers he treated with exaggerated courtesy, not out of genuine respect, but because he understood they had the power to cause problems for him. "Looks pretty standard," Tiffany replied, grateful that the morning flight didn't seem to include anyone whose poor treatment might generate the kind of complaint that reached supervisory attention. She'd learned to identify the passengers Blake enjoyed targeting: travelers who looked financially vulnerable, people traveling alone who wouldn't have witnesses to poor treatment, and especially passengers whose appearance or behavior suggested they might not know their rights or have the confidence to demand better service. Blake's philosophy of passenger management had been shaped by his military background, though not in the way most people might expect. He'd enlisted in the Air Force straight out of high school with dreams of becoming a pilot, convinced that his natural leadership abilities and commanding presence would make him perfect for the cockpit of a fighter jet. The rejection had been devastating and comprehensive. Blake had failed the psychological evaluations that were part of pilot training with assessors, noting concerns about his need to dominate interpersonal interactions and his inability to accept feedback from supervisors. The Air Force had offered him other positions, but Blake had seen anything other than pilot training as a personal failure and had left the service after completing his initial enlistment. The airline job had been intended as a temporary position while Blake figured out his next career move. But 8 years had passed, and he was still at Gate A7, having transformed what should have been customer service into a daily exercise in asserting the authority he'd been denied in military aviation. Every passenger interaction became an opportunity to prove that he was the one in control, that his decisions mattered, and that people needed his permission to get where they were going. The morning briefing from supervisory staff included the usual reminders about customer service standards and the importance of treating all passengers with respect. but Blake had learned to tune out these presentations while appearing to pay attention. He knew exactly how far he could push difficult passengers without generating the kind of documented complaints that might threaten his position, and he'd developed techniques for making people miserable while maintaining plausible deniability about his motivations. As the first passengers began arriving at the gate area for the 8:30 a.m. flight to Phoenix, Blake felt the familiar rush of anticipation that came with starting a new day of interactions where he held all the cards. The delayed flights from Denver meant that travelers would be stressed, tired, and emotionally vulnerable, which made them easier to control and less likely to cause problems when he decided to flex his authority. Blake straightened his tie, adjusted his posture behind the podium, and prepared to begin another day of proving that Gate A7 belonged to him, unaware that among the passengers who would approach his counter that morning was someone with the power to strip away everything he'd built and expose the cruelty he'd hidden behind his uniform. The Chicago O'Hare Terminal 2. Concourse thrummed with the controlled chaos of morning rush-hour aviation. A symphony of rolling luggage wheels, boarding announcements, and the underlying tension that came with weather delays rippling through the air traffic system. Diana Washington moved through the crowds with the practiced invisibility she'd perfected over years of undercover work, her worn sneakers silent against the polished floors as she observed the ecosystem of power and vulnerability that defined American air travel. The gate area around A7 had already begun to fill with passengers, their faces showing the familiar mixture of resignation and hope that characterized people whose plans depended entirely on the cooperation of airline employees. Diana positioned herself near a bank of charging stations where she could watch Blake Patterson's interactions while appearing to be just another traveler killing time before her flight. The first passenger to approach Blake's counter was an elderly man whose hands shook slightly as he held his boarding pass, and Diana immediately focused her attention on the interaction that was about to unfold. The man's confusion about gate changes was obvious and innocent, the kind of simple question that any experienced gate agent should be able to answer with patience and clarity. Instead, Blake's response dripped with condescension as he spoke slowly and loudly, as if the passenger's age automatically meant hearing problems or cognitive impairment. "Sir, the gate change was announced 30 minutes ago and it's been updated on all the monitors. You need to pay attention to these things if you want to catch your flight." Diana watched the elderly passenger's shoulders slump as Blake continued his unnecessarily harsh response, explaining the gate change as if it were the man's fault for not understanding the complexity of airport operations. The interaction wasn't technically illegal, but it represented exactly the kind of dignity violation that the complaints against Blake had described, the systematic degradation of passengers who appeared vulnerable or unlikely to fight back. The pattern continued as more passengers approached the counter, and Diana began to see why Blake had generated so many complaints without facing serious consequences. His cruelty was calibrated to stay just below the threshold that might trigger official intervention, but it was consistent enough to create a hostile environment for anyone who needed his assistance. When a young mother approached with questions about checking her car seat, Blake's impatience was palpable as he interrupted her explanation and spoke over her concerns about whether her infant's equipment would be handled properly. Diana noted the way Tiffany Rodriguez, the junior agent, watched these interactions with obvious discomfort, suggesting that Blake's behavior was recognized as problematic by his colleagues, even if it wasn't being reported through official channels. The morning's flight delays had created exactly the kind of stressful environment where Blake seemed to thrive, with passengers becoming increasingly desperate as their connections became more uncertain and their travel plans fell apart. Diana observed him denying reasonable requests with obvious satisfaction, wielding his computer access and policy knowledge like weapons against people who had no choice but to accept whatever treatment he decided to provide. Flight 847 to Phoenix was scheduled to begin boarding in 45 minutes, and Diana knew that her window for documenting Blake's behavior patterns was limited to the pre-boarding period when passengers were most likely to approach the gate with questions or requests. She had already witnessed enough policy violations to justify formal disciplinary action, but the complaints against Blake had suggested something more serious than routine rudeness. Diana checked her watch and made the decision to approach the counter herself, understanding that the interaction she was about to initiate would either provide the evidence needed to take serious action against Blake or expose her own identity in a way that could compromise the entire investigation. The risk was calculated but necessary, because sometimes the only way to document abuse of authority was to experience it directly. She gathered her worn tote bag and walked toward Gate A7's podium, deliberately adopting the slightly hesitant posture of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable in airport environments. Diana had learned that appearing confident or knowledgeable often led gate agents to provide better service, but she needed to present herself as the kind of passenger that Blake's pattern suggested he enjoyed intimidating. The passengers waiting in the gate area had formed an informal queue near Blake's counter, and Diana took her place behind a businessman who was arguing about seat assignments for what appeared to be the third or fourth time. Blake's responses to the man were professionally delivered but designed to shut down the conversation rather than solve the problem, and Diana could see the frustration building in both the passenger's face and in the expressions of people watching the interaction. When the businessman finally walked away from the counter, shaking his head, Diana stepped forward and made eye contact with Blake Patterson for the first time. She immediately felt the weight of his assessment as he scanned her appearance, taking in the worn jeans, the oversized hoodie, and the general presentation of someone who probably hadn't paid for premium services and might not understand her rights as a passenger. Blake's initial expression was one of barely contained impatience, as if Diana's very presence at his counter was an interruption of more important business, and she realized that the complaints against him had likely understated the problem rather than exaggerated it. The contempt in his eyes was immediate and obvious, based entirely on visual assumptions about her economic status and her ability to cause problems for him if he decided to provide poor service. Diana had approached hundreds of airline counters over the course of her career, both as a paying passenger and as a federal inspector, and she had never encountered a gate agent whose hostility was so immediately apparent. Blake Patterson wasn't just having a bad day or dealing with stressful circumstances. He was someone who had developed a systematic approach to making certain passengers feel unwelcome and powerless. The moment stretched between them as Diana prepared to make a simple, reasonable request that any competent gate agent should be able to handle with basic courtesy, unaware that Blake had already decided she was going to be the target for whatever frustrations he was carrying from the morning's delayed flights and difficult passengers. Behind Blake, Tiffany Rodriguez continued processing other passengers while stealing glances at the interaction that was about to unfold, her instincts already warning her that whatever was about to happen between Blake and this quiet woman in worn clothes was going to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed, but feeling powerless to intervene without risking her own position at the gate. Diana took a breath and prepared to speak, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Blake Patterson's pattern of passenger abuse could be documented thoroughly enough to justify the kind of intervention that would protect future travelers from the treatment she was about to experience firsthand. "Excuse me," Diana said, her voice deliberately soft and deferential as she approached Blake's counter, holding her boarding pass in both hands like an offering. "I'm hoping you might be able to help me with a seat change if it's possible." Blake didn't look up immediately, his fingers continuing to tap at his keyboard with the exaggerated precision of someone demonstrating how busy and important he was. Diana counted the seconds as she waited, noting the power play for what it was while maintaining the patient expression of someone who didn't want to cause trouble. When Blake finally raised his eyes to meet hers, Diana felt the full weight of his assessment as he took in her appearance with undisguised dismissal. His gaze lingered on the fraying cuff of her hoodie, the worn sneakers, and the overall presentation of someone who had probably purchased the cheapest ticket available and had no right to expect premium treatment. "What kind of seat change?" Blake asked, though his tone suggested that whatever Diana was about to request would be both unreasonable and impossible to accommodate. He positioned himself to loom over the counter, using his height advantage to create a physical dynamic that made passengers feel like supplicants rather than customers. Diana placed her boarding pass on the counter between them, pointing to the seat assignment with the kind of careful politeness that suggested she understood she was asking for a favor rather than making a demand. "I'm currently in 23B, which is a middle seat, and I saw on the app that there might be some aisle seats available closer to the front. I have a tight connection in Phoenix, so if it's at all possible to move me to something like 12C or 15D, I would really appreciate it." The request was reasonable, polite, and well within the normal range of passenger service interactions that gate agents handled dozens of times every day. Diana had deliberately chosen seats that were in the same service class and wouldn't require any additional payment, making this exactly the kind of accommodation that airlines routinely provided to travelers who asked respectfully. Blake's response was immediate and designed to establish that Diana had made a fundamental error in approaching him. "Ma'am, the mobile app doesn't control seat assignments at the gate. I do. And what you're asking for isn't how this works." Diana maintained her patient expression, despite the condescending tone, recognizing that Blake was already demonstrating the pattern of unnecessary aggression that had generated multiple complaints. "I understand that you have the final authority over seating," she replied carefully. "I'm just wondering if there's any flexibility since the flight doesn't appear to be completely full. Economy passengers don't get to shop for better seats just because they decide they don't like what they paid for." Blake said, his voice rising slightly to ensure that other passengers in the gate area could hear the interaction. Diana realized that he was performing for an audience, using her request as an opportunity to demonstrate his power over passengers who didn't meet his standards for deferential behavior. The businessman who had been arguing about seats earlier had moved to a nearby chair but was clearly listening to the conversation, and Diana noticed Tiffany Rodriguez watching the interaction with growing concern. Blake's behavior was already crossing professional boundaries, but Diana needed to document how far he would go when challenged with continued politeness rather than submission. "I completely understand your point about economy passengers," Diana said, keeping her voice level and respectful. "But since we're in the same service class and I'm not asking for an upgrade, I was hoping it might be possible as a courtesy. I'm happy to pay any change fee if that would make a difference." Blake's expression shifted from dismissive to openly hostile, as if Diana's persistence in making a reasonable request had personally offended him. He leaned forward over the counter, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate rather than communicate. "Let me explain something to you," Blake said, his voice dropping to a tone that carried menace beneath its professional veneer. "I have 200 passengers trying to get to Phoenix today. I have weather delays backing up flights all over the system. I have a crew that's running late because of air traffic control holds. What I don't have time for is someone who bought a basic economy ticket trying to negotiate for perks she didn't pay for." Diana felt the familiar calm that settled over her in tense situations, the professional detachment that allowed her to document violations while experiencing them. Blake's response had crossed from poor customer service into verbal aggression, and she could see that other passengers were beginning to pay attention to the interaction. "I appreciate the challenges you're dealing with," Diana replied, her voice remaining steady, despite Blake's obvious attempts to provoke a defensive reaction. "I'm not trying to add to your workload. I'm simply asking if a seat change might be possible, and if it's not, that's perfectly fine." Blake straightened up behind the counter, and Diana could see that her refusal to be intimidated had escalated his anger rather than diffusing it. He was clearly someone who expected his displays of authority to produce immediate submission, and Diana's continued politeness was being interpreted as defiance rather than courtesy. "You know what your problem is?" Blake said, his professional facade beginning to slip entirely. "You people always think you can argue your way into special treatment. You walk up to my counter with your demands and your attitude, thinking that if you just keep talking, eventually I'll give you what you want." The phrase "you people" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Diana's skin crawl even as she maintained her composed exterior. Blake had revealed the racial component of his hostility, confirming what the complaint pattern had suggested about his selection of passengers to target for poor treatment. "Sir, I haven't made any demands," Diana said quietly, her voice carrying just enough steel to suggest that she wasn't going to accept being spoken to with open disrespect. "I made a polite request, and I've accepted that the answer might be no. There's no need to speak to me in that tone." Blake's face flushed with anger at what he clearly interpreted as insubordination, as if Diana's request for basic courtesy was a challenge to his authority that couldn't be tolerated. He looked around the gate area, noting the passengers who were watching the interaction, and Diana realized that he was about to escalate the situation in a way that would provide exactly the kind of evidence she needed to take formal action. "If you don't like my tone," Blake said, his voice rising to ensure maximum audience impact, "you're welcome to find another airline. But as long as you're at my gate trying to get on my flight, you'll take whatever tone I decide to give you." Diana felt the weight of decision settling over her as she recognized that Blake Patterson was about to cross lines that would justify immediate intervention. She could reveal her identity now and end the interaction before it escalated further, or she could continue documenting his behavior until he provided evidence of violations that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The choice would determine not only her own immediate experience, but also the strength of any case against Blake and the airline that employed him. Diana looked into Blake's hostile eyes and made the decision to see exactly how far his abuse of authority would go when he believed he was dealing with someone who had no power to fight back. "Let me see your identification and boarding pass again," Blake demanded, extending his hand with the imperious gesture of someone who expected immediate compliance. Diana recognized the tactic for what it was, a fishing expedition designed to find some technicality that would justify denying her boarding or otherwise punishing her for the crime of making a reasonable request without sufficient deference. Diana hesitated for just a moment, understanding that handing over her passport would move the interaction into dangerous territory. Her federal credentials were safely hidden in her tote bag, but her personal passport would give Blake access to information he could use to escalate his harassment while she maintained her cover as an ordinary passenger. "My identification was already checked at the TSA checkpoint," Diana said, though she began reaching into her bag for her passport. "Is there a specific concern about my ticket or documentation?" Blake's smile was cold and triumphant, as if Diana's reasonable question had proven some point he was trying to make about difficult passengers. "Phoenix Airlines has the right to verify passenger identification at any point in the boarding process, especially when passengers are making unusual requests or displaying attitude problems." The accusation of having an attitude problem was rich, coming from someone who had spent the last 10 minutes demonstrating textbook hostile customer service. But Diana maintained her composure as she placed her passport on the counter. She had traveled internationally dozens of times over the past 5 years, and the document was in excellent condition despite normal wear from frequent use. Blake picked up the navy blue booklet with exaggerated care, as if handling evidence in a criminal investigation rather than processing routine travel documentation. Diana watched his face as he opened to the photo page, noting the theatrical way he held the passport up to compare her current appearance with the image taken 3 years earlier. "This photo doesn't look like you," Blake announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, tilting the document so that people in the waiting area could see him conducting what appeared to be a forensic examination. "Your hair is completely different and the facial structure seems off." Diana felt a chill of recognition as she understood what Blake was attempting to do. False accusations of fraudulent documentation were serious enough to justify involving airport security, and she realized that he was building toward a confrontation that would go far beyond poor customer service into potential criminal allegations. "The photo was taken 3 years ago when I renewed my passport," Diana explained, keeping her voice calm despite the gravity of what was happening. "My hairstyle has changed and I've lost some weight since then, but that's definitely me. The biometric data and security features will confirm the document's authenticity if you have any genuine concerns." Blake continued his performance, holding the passport closer to his face and frowning as if discovering serious irregularities in the security features. Diana could see Tiffany Rodriguez watching the interaction with obvious distress, clearly understanding that Blake was crossing professional boundaries, but apparently feeling powerless to intervene. "The lamination around the edges looks suspicious," Blake declared, running his finger along the perfectly normal edge sealing of the passport's data page. "And this binding seems loose, like someone might have tampered with it." Diana's professional training kicked in as she recognized that Blake was either completely ignorant about passport security features or was deliberately fabricating concerns to justify whatever he was planning to do next. Either way, she was now witnessing behavior that went far beyond customer service disputes into potential federal violations. "Sir, that passport was issued by the State Department and has been used for international travel as recently as 2 weeks ago," Diana said, her voice taking on a slight edge of authority despite her efforts to maintain her cover. "If you have legitimate concerns about document fraud, you should contact the appropriate authorities, rather than conducting your own authentication process." Blake's eyes narrowed at what he clearly interpreted as another challenge to his authority, and Diana realized that her knowledge of proper procedures had marked her as someone who might be more trouble than he had initially assessed. Instead of backing down, however, Blake seemed to double down on his accusations, as if proving his point had become more important than following proper protocols. "Ma'am, I've been working in aviation security for 8 years, and I know suspicious documentation when I see it," Blake said, though Diana noted that gate agents received minimal training in document authentication and had no authority to make determinations about passport validity. "This passport shows signs of alteration, and I cannot allow potentially fraudulent documents to be used for air travel." The businessman who had been watching the interaction stood up from his chair and approached the counter, his expression showing a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Excuse me, but I've been listening to this conversation, and that passport looks perfectly normal to me. What exactly are you claiming is wrong with it?" Blake turned his hostility toward the businessman, clearly resenting the interference from someone who wasn't intimidated by his badge and uniform. "Sir, this is none of your business, and if you continue to interfere with airline operations, I'll have you removed from the gate as well." "Removed from the gate," the businessman repeated, pulling out his phone and opening what appeared to be a recording app. "For asking a question about why you're harassing this woman over what looks like a perfectly normal passport." Diana watched the dynamics shifting as Blake realized that his behavior was being documented by someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by threats about being denied boarding. The businessman's intervention was providing exactly the kind of witness testimony that would be crucial if the situation escalated to formal complaints or legal action. "Put that phone away immediately," Blake demanded, his voice rising to a near shout. "Recording airline employees without permission is a federal offense, and I'm ordering you to delete that footage right now." Diana knew that Blake's claim about recording restrictions was completely false, but she could see that he was becoming increasingly desperate as his attempt to isolate and intimidate her was being disrupted by other passengers who weren't willing to stand by and watch obvious harassment. "Actually, recording in public areas of airports is perfectly legal," the businessman replied calmly, continuing to hold his phone in a way that captured both Blake's behavior and Diana's composed responses. "And what I'm documenting here looks like a gate agent making false accusations against a passenger for no apparent reason." Blake's face flushed deep red as he realized that his performance was backfiring spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of public documentation that could threaten his position if it reached supervisory attention. Diana could see the moment when Blake made the decision that would define the rest of the interaction. Instead of de-escalating the situation, he was going to double down and force a confrontation that would prove his authority over everyone at the gate. "Security," Blake called out, reaching for the radio on his belt. "I need immediate assistance at Gate A7. We have multiple disruptive passengers and suspected document fraud." Diana felt her heart rate increase as she understood that Blake was about to involve airport police in what had started as a simple request for a seat change. She still had time to reveal her identity and end the situation, but doing so would compromise the investigation and potentially allow Blake to claim that her undercover status invalidated whatever violations had already occurred. Tiffany Rodriguez finally found her voice, stepping closer to Blake's position behind the counter. "Blake, maybe we should just process her boarding pass and move on to the next passenger. The flight starts boarding in 20 minutes and we're going to have a line." Blake spun toward Tiffany with fury in his eyes, clearly viewing her suggestion as betrayal rather than professional advice. "Stay in your lane, Tiffany. I'm handling this situation and I don't need input from junior staff who don't understand security protocols." Diana watched Blake's treatment of his colleague with professional interest, noting that his pattern of intimidation extended to airline employees as well as passengers. Tiffany's attempt to defuse the situation had been reasonable and appropriate, but Blake's response suggested someone who viewed any questioning of his judgment as insubordination that needed to be crushed immediately. The radio call for security meant that airport police would arrive within minutes, and Diana knew that she was approaching the point where maintaining her cover would become impossible without subjecting herself to potential arrest and detention. Blake Patterson had demonstrated a pattern of behavior that justified immediate intervention, but the most damning evidence would come from whatever he did next with her passport. As if reading her thoughts, Blake picked up her passport again and held it with both hands, examining it with exaggerated suspicion while making sure that everyone in the gate area could see what he was doing. Diana felt a chill of premonition as she recognized that Blake was building toward something more serious than verbal harassment or false accusations. "This document is definitely compromised," Blake announced, holding the passport up like evidence in a criminal trial. "The security features are inconsistent, and I have reasonable suspicion that this is a fraudulent document being used for illegal travel." Diana's training told her to end the situation immediately, but her instincts as an investigator pushed her to see exactly how far Blake would go in his abuse of authority. The decision she made in the next few seconds would determine not only her own immediate safety, but also the strength of any case against Blake Patterson and the airline that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. "Sir, I need you to return my passport immediately," Diana said, her voice carrying a note of command that cut through Blake's performance like a blade. "You have no authority to confiscate travel documents, and if you have genuine concerns about authenticity, you need to contact the appropriate federal agencies rather than conducting your own investigation." Blake's grip on the passport tightened as Diana's words registered, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes as he weighed his options. He had gone too far to back down gracefully, but Diana's obvious knowledge of proper procedures was clearly making him question whether she was the easy target he had initially assessed her to be. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, with Blake holding Diana's passport in his hands, while she stared at him with growing authority, despite her deliberate disguise as a powerless passenger. Around them, the gate area had fallen into an uncomfortable silence as other travelers realized they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal airline customer service disputes. "Ma'am, you need to understand that I'm trying to protect the aviation system from security threats," Blake said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Diana could see him searching for a way to maintain his position while dealing with the growing realization that this interaction wasn't going according to his usual script. Diana took a step closer to the counter, her posture shifting slightly from deferential passenger to something more authoritative. "Mr. Patterson," she said, reading his name from the badge pinned to his uniform. "I'm going to give you one final opportunity to handle this situation professionally. Return my passport, apologize for the harassment, and we can both move on with our day." The use of his name seemed to startle Blake, as if Diana's ability to identify him personally had somehow shifted the power dynamic in a way that made him uncomfortable. He looked down at the passport in his hands, then back at Diana's face, and she could see the moment when his need to prove his authority overcame whatever remaining professional judgment he might have possessed. "You don't get to make demands at my gate," Blake said, his voice rising to a level that ensured everyone in the waiting area could hear him clearly. I don't care who you think you are or what you think you know about aviation regulations. Right now, you're a passenger with suspicious documentation, and I'm going to handle this situation exactly the way I see fit. Diana felt the familiar calm settling over her that always came in moments of crisis, the professional detachment that allowed her to observe and document even when she was personally involved in rapidly escalating situations. Blake Patterson was about to cross a line that would transform this incident from customer service harassment into a federal crime, and she was going to witness every moment of it. Blake. Don't, Tiffany Rodriguez said from her position behind the secondary computer terminal, her voice carrying a note of pleading that suggested she understood exactly what was about to happen. Just give her the passport back and let's move on, please. Blake turned toward Tiffany with fury in his expression, clearly viewing her intervention as the final straw in what had become a challenge to his authority from multiple directions. I told you to stay out of this, Tiffany. If you can't support me, then maybe you don't belong at this gate. Diana watched the exchange with professional interest, noting that Blake's pattern of intimidation extended to his colleagues as well as passengers, creating a work environment where potential witnesses to his misconduct would be afraid to speak up or intervene. The systemic nature of the problem was becoming clearer with every interaction. The businessman who had been recording the confrontation moved closer to the counter, his phone still capturing everything as Blake's behavior became increasingly erratic. Sir, I think you need to calm down and return this woman's passport. You're making a scene over nothing, and you're clearly in the wrong here. Blake's response was immediate and explosive, as if the businessman's reasonable suggestion had triggered something deep and violent in his psychology. I am not in the wrong. I am doing my job protecting aviation security from people who think they can intimidate their way onto airplanes with fake documents and entitled attitudes. Diana realized that Blake had reached the point where his need to be right had become more important than his career, his reputation, or even basic legal considerations. She could see in his eyes the dangerous combination of wounded pride and unchecked authority that turned customer service disputes into federal crimes. Mr. Patterson, Diana said, her voice dropping to a tone that carried absolute authority despite her civilian clothes and deliberately humble appearance. I am warning you for the final time. You are about to commit a serious crime if you damage that passport. Think very carefully about what you're about to do. Blake looked at Diana with something approaching hatred, as if her continued refusal to be intimidated by his displays of power had become a personal insult that demanded retaliation. He held her passport up in both hands, gripping it by the covers in a way that put dangerous pressure on the binding that held the document together. You want your passport back? Blake asked, his voice carrying a manic edge that made several nearby passengers take involuntary steps backward. Here's your passport. Diana watched in slow motion as Blake's hands moved in opposite directions, applying torque to the passport's binding with deliberate, methodical pressure. The document was designed to withstand normal handling, but it wasn't built to resist intentional destruction by someone determined to prove a point about power and control. The sound was distinctive and final, the sharp crack of binding stitching giving way under pressure, followed by the wet tearing of laminated security paper as the passport's data page separated from its cover. Blake had applied enough force to damage not just the binding, but also the integrated circuit chip that contained biometric data, effectively destroying the document's validity as a travel document. The gate area fell into complete silence as Blake tossed the ruined passport onto the counter between them, the two pieces of what had been Diana's valid federal travel document landing with a sound that seemed to echo through the terminal. Diana stared at the destroyed passport, feeling a mixture of professional satisfaction at having documented such clear evidence of federal crimes and personal outrage at the violation of her rights as an American citizen. There, Blake said, wiping his hands on his uniform pants as if cleaning them of contamination. Problem solved. That fraudulent document is no longer a threat to aviation security, and you can go down to customer service to discuss rebooking once you have valid identification." Diana picked up the pieces of her passport with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. The deliberate destruction of a federal document by an airline employee was a felony that would result in immediate termination federal charges and permanent disqualification from any position requiring security clearance. "Mr. Patterson." Diana said, her voice carrying a quality that made everyone within hearing distance stop what they were doing and pay attention. "You have just committed destruction of federal property, a crime punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. You have also interfered with the lawful travel of a federal employee, which carries additional penalties that I don't think you understand." Blake laughed, a sound that contained no humor but plenty of manic satisfaction. "Federal employee. Lady, you're wearing a hoodie and sneakers. You bought the cheapest ticket available, and you've been trying to scam your way into a better seat since you walked up to my counter. Save the threats for someone who's impressed by your performance." Diana looked around the gate area, noting the passengers who were staring in shock at what they had witnessed, the businessman who was still recording everything on his phone, and Tiffany Rodriguez, who appeared to be on the verge of tears. The evidence was overwhelming, documented from multiple angles, and witnessed by dozens of people who would be able to testify about Blake Patterson's deliberate destruction of a valid passport. The moment had arrived when Diana Washington had to make the choice that would define everything that happened next: maintain her cover and allow herself to be processed as a victim of Blake's crime, or reveal her identity and bring the full weight of federal authority to bear on someone who had just made the worst mistake of his career. Airport security officers were already walking toward Gate A7, summoned by Blake's earlier radio call, and Diana knew that the next few minutes would determine not just her own immediate circumstances, but also the extent of the evidence that could be gathered against Blake Patterson and the airline that had enabled his pattern of abuse. Diana reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number that would connect her directly to the federal security director for O'Hare Airport. Blake Patterson thought he had just destroyed the passport of a powerless passenger, but he was about to discover that some mistakes carry consequences that extend far beyond anything his imagination could have prepared him for. The immediate aftermath of Blake's destruction of Diana's passport created a pocket of stunned silence in the usually bustling gate area, as if the surrounding chaos of the airport had been temporarily suspended by the sheer audacity of what everyone had just witnessed. Diana stood perfectly still, holding the two pieces of her ruined passport, while her mind catalogued the federal violations that had occurred in full view of multiple witnesses. "Jesus Christ," the businessman with the recording phone whispered, though his words carried clearly in the unnatural quiet. Did that actually just happen? Did he actually rip up her passport? Blake seemed to realize for the first time that his action had created exactly the kind of public spectacle that supervisors noticed and remembered. But instead of showing concern or regret, he doubled down on his justification with the desperate energy of someone who had committed to a course of action and couldn't find a way to retreat gracefully. "I removed a fraudulent document from circulation," Blake announced to the gate area, his voice carrying defensive aggression that convinced no one, least of all himself. "That's exactly what we're trained to do when passengers attempt to use suspicious identification for air travel." Tiffany Rodriguez found her voice again, stepping out from behind her computer terminal with shaking hands. "Blake, you can't just destroy someone's passport. We don't have authority to do that." "You should have called security and let them handle it if you really thought there was a problem." Blake spun toward Tiffany with fury that had been building throughout the confrontation, clearly viewing her public questioning of his judgment as the final betrayal in what had become a completely untenable situation. "Tiffany, I warned you to stay out of this. If you can't back me up, then maybe you need to think about whether you want to keep working at this gate." Diana watched the exchange with professional interest, noting how Blake's pattern of intimidation extended to anyone who might serve as a witness to his misconduct. The threat against Tiffany's employment was itself a violation of airline policy and potentially illegal retaliation for her refusal to support obviously improper behavior. "I'm not staying out of this," Tiffany said, her voice growing stronger as she found her courage. "You just destroyed a passenger's legal travel document in front of 50 people. I don't care if you write me up, Blake. This is wrong, and everyone here knows it's wrong." The businessman who had been recording stepped closer to the counter, his phone still capturing everything as Blake's situation continued to deteriorate. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Diana directly, "I got the whole thing on video. The way he examined your passport, the things he said, and especially the moment when he deliberately tore it apart. If you want to file a complaint, I'll be happy to provide this footage as evidence." Diana nodded gratefully, understanding that the businessman's recording would provide crucial documentation of Blake's behavior from an independent witness perspective. "Thank you. I may need to contact you about that, and I appreciate your willingness to get involved when you didn't have to." Blake's desperation was becoming more apparent as he realized that his attempt to assert dominance over a single passenger had created a coalition of witnesses who were documenting his every word and action. Airport security officers were visible at the far end of the concourse, walking toward Gate A7 in response to his earlier call for assistance, but Blake seemed to understand that their arrival might not provide the support he had expected. "Security is on the way," Blake said, though his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier. "They'll sort this out and determine who was really in the wrong here." Diana reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts with deliberate precision while Blake watched with growing unease. The call she was about to make would end any possibility of maintaining her undercover status, but Blake Patterson had crossed lines that demanded immediate federal intervention. "Who are you calling?" Blake demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he realized that Diana's behavior throughout the confrontation had been completely inconsistent with his assumption that she was a powerless passenger who would accept whatever treatment he decided to provide. "Someone who needs to know what just happened here," Diana replied calmly, pressing the contact for Marcus Vance, the Federal Security Director for O'Hare Airport. The phone rang twice before Vance's familiar voice answered, with the brusque efficiency of someone who dealt with genuine security emergencies on a daily basis. "Vance." "Marcus, this is Diana Washington. I'm at Terminal 2 Gate A7 and I need immediate assistance. A Phoenix Airlines gate agent just destroyed my passport during what was supposed to be a routine undercover audit." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Vance responded, and Diana could hear the controlled anger in his voice as he processed the implications of what she had just told him. "Diana, did you just say that an airline employee destroyed your federal travel document?" "That's correct. The agent's name is Blake Patterson, and the entire incident was witnessed by multiple passengers and recorded on at least one phone. I need you to contact Regional Director Chen immediately, and we're going to need a full investigation team here within the hour." Blake's face had gone white as he listened to Diana's side of the conversation, and she could see the dawning realization that his assumption about her identity and authority had been catastrophically wrong. The businesslike tone of her conversation and her obvious familiarity with federal security protocols were painting a picture that terrified him. "Ma'am, who are you?" Blake asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as the full magnitude of his mistake began to register. "What's your real name?" Diana ended her call with Vance and turned her full attention to Blake for the first time since the confrontation had begun, allowing her professional authority to show through the deliberate disguise she had maintained throughout the morning. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "My name is Diana Washington, and I'm a senior aviation safety inspector with the Federal Aviation Administration. You just destroyed the passport of a federal officer while she was conducting an official investigation into complaints about your conduct, Mr. Patterson. You've committed multiple federal crimes in front of dozens of witnesses, and your career in aviation is over." The words hit Blake like physical blows, and Diana watched his legs actually wobble as he gripped the counter for support. Around them, the gate area had fallen into complete silence again as passengers processed the revelation that they had just witnessed a federal crime being committed against a government inspector. "Federal," Inspector Blake repeated, his voice hollow with shock and growing horror. "No, that's impossible. You're wearing jeans and a hoodie. You bought an economy ticket. You can't be." "I'm conducting an undercover audit based on multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment of passengers at this gate." Diana continued, her voice remaining calm and professional, despite the personal violations she had experienced. "Your behavior today has confirmed every allegation in my case file, and you've added federal crimes that will result in criminal charges, as well as the termination of your employment." Tiffany Rodriguez had moved to a position where she could see Diana clearly, and her expression showed a mixture of awe and relief as she realized that Blake's pattern of abusive behavior was finally going to face serious consequences. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said quietly. "I've watched him treat passengers like this for months, but I was afraid of losing my job." Diana turned to Tiffany with a gentler expression, understanding the impossible position that junior employees faced when working under supervisors who abused their authority. "You spoke up when it mattered most, and that took courage. Your willingness to challenge his behavior in front of witnesses will be important when we investigate how this situation was allowed to develop." Blake was staring at Diana as if she were a ghost, his mind apparently unable to process the transformation from victim to federal authority figure. The airport security officers had reached the gate area and were assessing the situation, but their arrival no longer represented salvation for Blake's position. Instead, they would become part of the evidence chain in a federal investigation that would dismantle everything he had built over 8 years of unchecked misconduct. "I didn't know," Blake whispered, though whether he was speaking to Diana, to himself, or to the universe at large wasn't clear. "I had no idea who you were." Diana picked up the pieces of her destroyed passport and placed them carefully in an evidence bag she pulled from her tote, along with the federal credentials that would have prevented the entire confrontation if she had chosen to reveal them earlier. "Mr. Patterson, that's exactly the problem. You treated me badly because you thought I was powerless, not because you had any legitimate concerns about my documentation or behavior. If you only show respect to people when you fear their authority, then you have no business working in customer service or aviation safety." Airport police officers Martinez and Johnson approached Gate A7 with the confident stride of law enforcement officers responding to what they expected to be a routine passenger disturbance, their hands resting casually on their equipment belts as they assessed the scene before them. Diana watched their approach with professional interest, understanding that the next few minutes would demonstrate whether the problems at O'Hare extended beyond Blake Patterson to include the security officers who were supposed to provide oversight of airline operations. Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran with the Chicago Police Department who had transferred to airport security 5 years earlier, immediately focused his attention on Blake, whose uniform and position behind the gate counter established him as the authority figure in whatever dispute had occurred. The visual dynamics were exactly what Diana had expected, two white officers instinctively aligning with the white airline employee against the black woman in civilian clothes. "What's the situation here?" Martinez asked Blake, though his tone suggested that he had already made assumptions about who was in the right and who was causing problems. Diana noted that neither officer had bothered to speak with any of the passenger witnesses or attempt to gather information from multiple perspectives before deciding how to handle the call. Blake straightened up behind the counter, his confidence returning slightly now that law enforcement had arrived to validate his authority and deal with what he was preparing to characterize as an unruly passenger situation. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. We have a passenger who presented fraudulent travel documents and became increasingly aggressive when I questioned the authenticity of her passport." Diana listened to Blake's characterization of events with the detached interest of someone documenting official misconduct from multiple sources, understanding that his willingness to lie to federal officers would add additional charges to what was already a substantial criminal case. The businessman who had recorded the entire interaction stepped forward with his phone, but Officer Johnson waved him back without asking what evidence he might have captured. "Sir, step back and let us handle this," Johnson said to the businessman, whose obvious eagerness to provide witness testimony was being treated as unwanted interference rather than valuable evidence. Diana realized that the officers were following a script that prioritized rapid resolution over accurate fact-finding, exactly the kind of approach that had allowed Blake's pattern of misconduct to continue unchecked. Officer Martinez turned his attention to Diana, his expression carrying the familiar mixture of skepticism and assumption that she had encountered throughout her career when dealing with law enforcement officers who had prejudged situations based on visual assessments rather than evidence. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the counter and explain what happened here from your perspective." Diana remained in position, understanding that her movement away from the counter would be interpreted as submission to the officer's authority and would make it more difficult for witnesses to observe whatever happened next. "Officer, I need you to understand that this situation is more complicated than it appears. Mr. Patterson destroyed my federal travel document after I made a simple request for a seat change, and the entire interaction was witnessed by multiple passengers." Martinez's expression shifted to one of barely contained irritation, as if Diana's refusal to immediately comply with his instruction to step back had confirmed Blake's characterization of her as an uncooperative passenger. "Ma'am, I don't care about your seat change request. What I care about is that you're being disruptive in a secure area of the airport, and that ends right now." The dismissive response revealed exactly the kind of tunnel vision that Diana had learned to expect from security officers who had been trained to prioritize order over justice, but she needed to document how far their bias would take them before revealing her federal authority. "Officer, I haven't been disruptive. I made a polite request. Mr. Patterson became hostile, and then he deliberately destroyed my passport. Multiple people witnessed what happened, and at least one person recorded the entire interaction." Johnson stepped closer to Diana, his body language designed to intimidate rather than investigate, while Martinez positioned himself to block her movement away from the counter. Diana recognized the coordination between the two officers and understood that they had decided to resolve the situation by removing her rather than determining what had actually occurred. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us," Johnson said, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. "You're being detained for disturbing the peace and interfering with airline operations." Diana felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with crisis situations, but her voice remained perfectly calm as she responded to what was clearly an inappropriate arrest based on false information and racial bias. "Officers, I strongly advise you to review the security footage from this gate before you take any enforcement action. What you're about to do will end your careers if you don't stop and think about what's really happening here." Martinez interpreted Diana's warning as a threat rather than advice, and his response demonstrated exactly the kind of escalation that turned customer service disputes into federal civil rights violations. "Are you threatening us, ma'am? Because that's not going to help your situation at all." "I'm not threatening anyone," Diana replied, extending her hands in a gesture of cooperation while maintaining her position near the counter where witnesses could clearly see what was happening. "I'm telling you that you're making a serious mistake if you arrest me without investigating what actually occurred here." Blake had been watching the interaction with growing satisfaction, clearly believing that the arrival of airport police had validated his authority and would result in Diana being removed from the gate area in handcuffs. "Officers, she's been argumentative and disruptive since she approached my counter. She refused to accept my determination that her documentation was suspicious, and she became increasingly hostile when I tried to confiscate the fraudulent passport." Diana listened to Blake's lies with professional detachment, understanding that his willingness to provide false information to law enforcement officers would add obstruction of justice charges to his growing list of federal crimes. The security cameras above Gate A7 had captured every moment of the interaction, and the businessman's phone recording would provide additional evidence that would contradict every element of Blake's fabricated narrative. That is a complete misrepresentation of what happened. Diana said, her voice carrying enough authority to make both officers pause slightly in their movement toward her. Mr. Patterson destroyed my passport because I refused to be intimidated by his hostile behavior, not because there were any legitimate concerns about the document's authenticity. Tiffany Rodriguez stepped forward from her position behind the secondary computer terminal, her decision to publicly contradict Blake's version of events, representing a moment of moral courage that Diana would remember long after the immediate crisis had passed. Officers, I work with Blake and I watched the whole thing. He was completely out of line with this passenger, and he destroyed her passport deliberately when she asked to speak to a supervisor. Martinez turned toward Tiffany with obvious irritation, as if her willingness to provide witness testimony was complicating what should have been a simple passenger removal. "Ma'am, we don't need airline employees getting involved in this situation. Please step back and let us handle it." The dismissal of Tiffany's testimony revealed the depth of the officers' commitment to their predetermined narrative, and Diana realized that they were going to proceed with her arrest, regardless of witness statements or evidence that contradicted Blake's claims. The pattern was depressingly familiar: law enforcement officers choosing expedient resolution over accurate investigation, particularly when the dispute involved a black woman challenging white authority figures. "Officers," Diana said, her voice taking on the commanding tone that she used in federal courtrooms and congressional hearings. "I am going to comply with your instructions, but I need you to understand that you are making a career-ending mistake if you proceed without reviewing the available evidence." Johnson moved behind Diana and began the process of applying handcuffs, his actions swift and practiced despite the lack of any legitimate justification for her arrest. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." Diana felt the cold steel of the handcuffs closing around her wrists, the physical violation adding another layer to what was already a comprehensive documentation of civil rights violations by both airline and airport security personnel. She had allowed the situation to escalate this far to gather evidence, but each moment of continued injustice was adding zeros to the financial settlement that Phoenix Airlines and the airport authority would eventually be forced to pay. "You're making a mistake," Diana said quietly as the handcuffs locked into place. Her words directed not just at the officers, but at Blake Patterson, whose satisfied smirk suggested that he believed he had won a victory rather than destroying his own career. A very expensive mistake. As officers Martinez and Johnson began leading Diana away from Gate A7, the businessman with the recording phone called out to her. "Ma'am, I got everything on video. Don't worry, the truth is going to come out." Blake's response was immediate and revealing, demonstrating that his pattern of intimidation extended to anyone who might provide evidence against him. "Sir, if you interfere with this investigation or try to contact that passenger, you'll be banned from this airline permanently." Diana smiled slightly as she was led toward the airport security office, understanding that Blake Patterson had just threatened a witness in front of multiple people while being recorded, adding witness intimidation to his growing list of federal violations. The machinery of injustice was working exactly as she had expected, and every moment of continued misconduct was strengthening the case that would ultimately destroy the careers of everyone involved in her wrongful arrest. The airport security holding room smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, a windowless concrete box painted in the kind of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone unfortunate enough to be detained there. Diana sat on the metal bench with her hands cuffed behind her back, maintaining perfect posture despite the uncomfortable position as she mentally documented every aspect of her wrongful arrest for the federal lawsuit that would inevitably follow. Officer Martinez sat at a scarred metal desk across from her, pecking at a keyboard with 2 fingers, while occasionally glancing up to study Diana's face as if trying to reconcile her composed demeanor with his assumptions about disruptive passengers. The paperwork he was completing would become evidence in a federal civil rights case, and Diana found herself almost grateful for his thoroughness in documenting the violation of her constitutional rights. Full name, Martinez asked, though his tone suggested that he expected Diana to provide false information or refuse to cooperate with what he clearly viewed as routine processing of an unruly traveler. Diana could see that he was approaching the detention as a simple matter of backing up Blake Patterson's authority, rather than investigating what had actually occurred at Gate A7. "Diana Washington," she replied calmly, her voice carrying none of the submission or anger that Martinez had probably expected from someone in handcuffs. Diana had been in more hostile situations during her federal career, and she understood that maintaining professional composure would be crucial for the credibility of any subsequent testimony about her treatment. Address Martinez continued typing slowly, as if each letter required significant concentration. Diana provided her Arlington, Virginia address, noting how Martinez's expression shifted slightly when he heard that she lived in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area rather than somewhere that suggested lower economic status or limited education. Occupation, Martinez asked, and Diana paused for just a moment before providing the answer that would transform the entire situation once Martinez bothered to verify the information he was recording. "Federal Aviation Administration," Diana said, simply watching Martinez's fingers freeze over the keyboard as the implications of what she had just told him began to register. "I'm a senior aviation safety inspector." Martinez looked up from his computer screen with an expression that mixed skepticism and the first hint of concern, as if Diana's claim might be more than the desperate lie he had initially assumed it to be. "You're saying you work for the government." "I'm saying I'm a federal officer conducting an official investigation, and you just arrested me based on false accusations from the airline employee." "I was investigating," Diana replied, her voice remaining level despite the magnitude of what Martinez was slowly beginning to understand. "My credentials are in my tote bag, which should be on the evidence table behind you." Martinez turned to look at the table where Diana's belongings had been placed when she was brought into the holding room, his eyes focusing on the worn leather bag that had seemed unremarkable when he had dismissed her as just another difficult passenger. Diana could see the moment when Martinez began to question whether his assumptions about the situation might have been catastrophically wrong. "You want me to believe that a federal inspector dresses like a homeless person and flies economy class?" Martinez asked, though his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier. Diana recognized the defensive response of someone who was beginning to realize that they might have made a serious error in judgment. "I want you to verify my identity before you complete paperwork that will end your career," Diana said, her tone shifting to carry the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with law enforcement officers who had overstepped their boundaries. "My federal credentials are in the inner pocket of that bag, along with government-issued equipment that will confirm everything I've told you." Martinez stood up from his desk with obvious reluctance, understanding that opening Diana's bag would either prove that she was lying about her identity or confirm that he had just arrested a federal officer based on the word of an airline employee. Either way, the next few minutes would determine whether his career in airport security would continue or end in disgrace and potential criminal charges. Diana watched Martinez approach the evidence table with growing trepidation written across his face, and she felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal sympathy for someone whose assumptions about race and authority were about to be shattered in the most expensive way possible. Martinez had made the same mistake as Blake Patterson, assuming that Diana's appearance and demeanor meant she lacked the power to hold him accountable for violating her rights. Martinez lifted Diana's tote bag and placed it on the desk, his hands actually shaking slightly as he realized that whatever he found inside would determine whether he spent the rest of the day completing routine paperwork or calling lawyers to discuss federal civil rights violations. Diana could see him hoping that her credentials would be fake or non-existent, allowing him to proceed with her prosecution as a disruptive passenger. The first items Martinez pulled from the bag were innocuous enough: a water bottle, a paperback novel, a phone charger, and other personal items that confirmed Diana's cover story as an ordinary traveler. But as he reached deeper into the bag, his fingers encountered the ruggedized case that contained Diana's government-issued tablet, and the weight of the device made him pause. Federal equipment is heavier than civilian electronics. Diana observed helpfully, watching Martinez's face grow pale as he lifted the tablet case and saw the Department of Transportation seal embossed on its surface. The case is designed to protect sensitive information during fieldwork, and the device inside contains access to databases that only federal inspectors can use. Martinez set the tablet case on the desk with exaggerated care, as if it might explode if handled incorrectly, and Diana could see him calculating the implications of having arrested someone who carried official government equipment. But the worst revelation was yet to come, hidden in the inner pocket that Diana had specifically mentioned when she'd told Martinez how to verify her identity. The black leather credential wallet slid out of the bag's inner pocket with the weight of absolute authority, and Martinez actually gasped when he saw the federal shield embossed on its cover. Diana had carried those credentials for 15 years, and they had opened doors, commanded respect, and established her authority in situations ranging from congressional hearings to hostile inspections of failing airlines. Martinez opened the credential wallet with trembling hands, and Diana watched his face drain of all color as he stared at her official photograph, her federal badge, and the identification that confirmed everything she had told him about her position and authority. The silence in the holding room stretched for what felt like several minutes as Martinez processed the magnitude of his mistake. Senior Aviation Safety Inspector Martinez read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, as he studied Diana's credentials. Federal Aviation Administration. Top secret clearance. He looked up at Diana with an expression of pure horror, finally understanding that he had handcuffed and arrested someone who outranked every airport security official at O'Hare. Officer Martinez. Diana said, her voice carrying the full authority of her federal position for the first time since the confrontation had begun. I need you to remove these handcuffs immediately, and then I need you to make some very important phone calls before this situation gets any worse than it already is. Martinez dropped Diana's credentials as if they were red-hot, his hands shaking so badly that he had trouble fitting the key into the handcuff locks. Diana felt the steel bracelets fall away from her wrists, leaving red marks that would serve as physical evidence of her unlawful detention, and she rubbed the circulation back into her hands while Martinez backed away from her as if she might explode. "Ma'am, Inspector Washington." "I didn't know." Martinez stammered, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized that his career in law enforcement was probably over and that federal charges against him were not only possible but likely. "The gate agent said you were disruptive and we just responded to his call for assistance. Officer, I told you repeatedly that you were making a mistake," Diana replied, standing up and adjusting her clothes while Martinez watched with growing panic. "I warned you to review the evidence before taking enforcement action, and you chose to ignore witness testimony and arrest me based solely on the accusations of someone who had just committed multiple federal crimes." Martinez looked at Diana's credentials lying on the desk, then at the government equipment that confirmed her authority, and finally at Diana herself as she transformed from detained passenger to federal inspector with the power to end careers and file criminal charges. "What do you need me to do?" Diana walked to the evidence table and began gathering her belongings, every movement demonstrating that she was no longer a prisoner, but a federal officer who had been unlawfully detained. "First, you're going to call Federal Security Director Marcus Vance and inform him that you have wrongfully arrested an FAA inspector. Then you're going to call your supervisor and explain that you need immediate legal representation. And then you're going to escort me back to Gate A7, where we're going to arrest Blake Patterson for destruction of federal property." Martinez reached for his phone with the desperate urgency of someone trying to minimize damage that had already spiraled far beyond his ability to control, understanding that the next few phone calls would determine whether he faced disciplinary action, termination, or federal prosecution for violating the civil rights of a federal officer. Diana clipped her federal badge to her shirt collar where it would be visible to everyone they encountered during the walk back to Gate A7, and watched Martinez struggle to explain to his supervisor why he had arrested an FAA inspector based on the accusations of an airline employee who had destroyed her passport. The conversation was brief and one-sided, consisting mostly of Martinez saying, "Yes, sir, and I understand, sir," while his supervisor presumably delivered the kind of professional assessment that ended careers. "He wants to speak with you," Martinez said, holding out his phone with the expression of someone offering evidence of his own professional destruction. Diana accepted the phone, understanding that her conversation with Martinez's supervisor would establish the official record of how airport security had handled the situation. "This is Inspector Washington," Diana said into the phone, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to dealing with law enforcement supervisors who had allowed their officers to violate federal law. The conversation that followed would be recorded, documented, and used as evidence in both criminal prosecutions and civil lawsuits against everyone who had participated in her wrongful arrest. The walk from the airport security office back to Gate A7 felt like a perp walk in reverse with Diana Washington, now clearly identified as a federal inspector, while Officer Martinez trailed behind her like a condemned man approaching his execution. Diana's badge hung prominently from her shirt collar, transforming her from detained passenger to government authority in the eyes of everyone they passed, and she could feel the shift in how people responded to her presence. Terminal 2 buzzed with the usual chaos of delayed flights and frustrated travelers, but Diana moved through the concourse with the purposeful stride of someone who had official business to conduct rather than a connection to make. Martinez had radioed ahead to inform Gate A7 that they were returning, though he had been deliberately vague about the circumstances that had led to Diana's release from custody. As they approached the gate area, Diana could see that the situation had evolved significantly during her detention, with additional airline personnel clustered around Blake Patterson's counter, and what appeared to be a supervisor attempting to manage the growing crowd of passengers who were demanding explanations about the delay in boarding. The businessman who had recorded the passport destruction was holding court with a group of travelers replaying the footage on his phone, while other passengers shook their heads in disgust. Blake was still at his position behind the podium, but Diana could see that his earlier confidence had given way to nervous energy as he dealt with increasingly hostile passengers and what appeared to be uncomfortable questions from airline supervisors. Tiffany Rodriguez was processing passengers at the secondary counter, but her attention kept drifting to Blake as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. "There she is," the businessman called out when he spotted Diana approaching the gate, his voice carrying relief and vindication in equal measure. "I told everyone you'd be back to straighten this out. That guy had no right to destroy your passport." Diana nodded gratefully to the businessman, understanding that his willingness to document and speak up about what he had witnessed had been crucial in preserving evidence of Blake's misconduct. "Thank you for recording everything and for speaking up when you didn't have to. Your actions may have prevented other passengers from experiencing the same treatment." Blake looked up at the sound of Diana's voice, and she watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and growing horror as he realized that she had not only been released from custody, but was returning to the gate with obvious authority, rather than as a passenger under arrest. The federal badge on her collar was visible from across the gate area, and Diana could see the moment when Blake understood that his assumptions about her identity had been catastrophically wrong. "That's impossible," Blake said, though his voice lacked conviction as he stared at Diana's credentials. "She's a passenger. She was arrested for using fraudulent documents and being disruptive. She can't be... Mr. Patterson," Diana said, her voice carrying across the gate area with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in hostile environments. "I am Diana Washington, Senior Aviation Safety Inspector with the Federal Aviation Administration. You destroyed the passport of a federal officer who was conducting an official investigation into complaints about your conduct." The gate area fell silent as passengers and airline personnel processed Diana's revelation. understanding that they had witnessed something far more serious than a customer service dispute. Blake gripped the edge of his counter as if the physical support might help him process information that threatened to collapse his understanding of everything that had happened over the past 2 hours. Federal Inspector Blake repeated, his voice cracking as he stared at Diana's badge. "But you were wearing jeans. You bought an economy ticket. You looked like..." "I looked like someone you thought you could intimidate without consequences." Diana finished stepping closer to Blake's counter with the confidence of someone who held all the cards in a game that Blake was only now beginning to understand. "That was the point of my undercover investigation, Mr. Patterson. I needed to document how you treat passengers when you believe they have no power to hold you accountable." Tiffany Rodriguez had stopped processing passengers entirely and was staring at Diana with a mixture of awe and relief, finally understanding why the quiet woman in worn clothes had remained so composed despite Blake's escalating harassment. "I knew something was different about you," Tiffany said quietly. "You never acted scared even when Blake was being awful." Blake's supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Janet Mills, who had arrived during Diana's detention, stepped forward with the expression of someone who was calculating the magnitude of the crisis that had just engulfed her gate operation. "Inspector Washington, I'm Janet Mills, station manager for Phoenix Airlines. I had no idea that you were conducting an investigation, and I want to assure you that Mr. Patterson's behavior does not represent our company's values." Diana turned her attention to Janet with the clinical focus of someone gathering evidence for what would inevitably become a federal case against the airline. "Ms. Mills, my investigation was prompted by multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment of passengers at this gate. Your employee's behavior today has confirmed every allegation in my case file, and he has added federal crimes that will result in criminal prosecution." Blake was still staring at Diana, as if she were a ghost, his mind apparently unable to process the transformation from victim to federal authority figure. I didn't know, he whispered, though whether he was speaking to Diana, to his supervisor, or to himself wasn't clear. "I had no idea who you were." Diana pulled the evidence bag containing the pieces of her destroyed passport from her tote bag, holding it up for everyone in the gate area to see. "Mr. Patterson, that's exactly the problem. You didn't destroy my passport because you had legitimate concerns about its authenticity. You destroyed it because you thought I was powerless, and you wanted to prove that you could hurt me without facing any consequences." Martinez, who had been standing awkwardly behind Diana throughout the confrontation, finally found his voice. "Inspector, what do you need me to do?" "My supervisor said to provide whatever assistance you require." Diana turned to Martinez with an expression that mixed professional authority with personal disappointment at how the situation had been handled. "Officer, I need you to place Mr. Patterson under arrest for destruction of federal property interference with a federal investigation and civil rights violations. And then I need you to secure this gate area as a crime scene while we wait for the FBI to arrive." Blake's legs actually buckled at Diana's words, and he had to grip the counter to remain standing as the reality of criminal charges finally penetrated his shock. "Arrest. But I was just doing my job. I thought she was using fake documents. I was trying to protect aviation security." "Mr. Patterson," Diana said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you committed multiple federal crimes in front of dozens of witnesses because you assumed that a black woman in comfortable clothes had no right to be treated with dignity. Your career in aviation is over, and you will face prosecution for every violation I witnessed today." Janet Mills stepped forward with the desperate energy of someone trying to minimize corporate liability in a situation that was spiraling completely out of control. "Inspector Washington, Phoenix Airlines takes these allegations very seriously, and we want to cooperate fully with your investigation. Mr. Patterson will be terminated immediately and will implement whatever reforms you recommend." Diana studied Janet with the calculating expression of someone who had dealt with corporate executives trying to escape responsibility for employee misconduct. "Ms. Mills, This isn't just about Mr. Patterson's behavior. This is about a culture that allowed him to target vulnerable passengers for 8 years without consequences. My investigation will examine how your company's policies and training contributed to the pattern of discrimination that brought me to this gate." Blake had gone completely white as he understood that his termination was just the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond his employment with Phoenix Airlines. "Please," he said, his voice breaking as he looked at Diana with desperation. "I'll apologize. I'll do whatever you want. Don't destroy my life over one mistake." Diana looked at Blake with something that might have been pity if it weren't overshadowed by professional obligation and personal outrage at the treatment she had experienced. "Mr. Patterson, this wasn't one mistake. This was a pattern of behavior that hurt countless passengers before me, and it would have continued hurting people if I hadn't been here to document it. The consequences you're facing are the result of choices you made, not actions I'm taking." Officer Martinez approached Blake with handcuffs, his movements reluctant but determined as he understood that his own future depended on handling this arrest properly after his earlier mistakes. "Blake Patterson, you're under arrest for destruction of federal property and interference with a federal officer. You have the right to remain silent." Diana watched Blake's arrest with professional satisfaction, understanding that justice was finally being served for not only her own treatment, but for all the passengers who had been subjected to his pattern of discrimination and abuse. The transformation was complete. Blake Patterson had gone from king of Gate A7 to federal defendant in less than 3 hours, and his fall from power would serve as a warning to anyone else who thought they could hide behind a uniform while violating the rights of the people they were supposed to serve. The transformation of Gate A7 from a routine boarding area into the epicenter of a federal investigation happened with the swift efficiency that characterized government responses to serious misconduct, and Diana Washington found herself at the center of a controlled storm of activity. As FBI agents, FAA officials, and airline executives converged on Terminal 2 with the urgency of people dealing with a crisis that threatened careers, reputations, and potentially the operating authority of a major airline. Federal Security Director Marcus Vance arrived within 30 minutes of Diana's call, accompanied by a team of investigators whose presence immediately elevated the situation from local misconduct to federal case. Vance was an imposing figure whose 25 years in federal law enforcement had taught him to assess complex situations quickly and take decisive action when government authority had been violated or disrespected. Diana Vance said as he approached the gate area, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had just learned that one of his top investigators had been assaulted and wrongfully arrested while conducting official business. "Are you injured? Do you need medical attention before we proceed with documenting what happened here?" Diana showed Vance the red marks on her wrists from the handcuffs, evidence that would be photographed and included in the federal case file that was already being assembled by the FBI agents who were setting up a command post near the gate. "I'm fine, Marcus, but we have a comprehensive pattern of civil rights violations that extends beyond just Blake Patterson's behavior." The airport security response was equally problematic. Vance nodded grimly as he surveyed the scene, taking note of the passengers who were still waiting to board their delayed flight, the airline personnel who were clustered in worried conversations, and the obvious tension that filled the gate area like smoke from an unseen fire. "Walk me through what happened, and don't leave out any details. We're going to prosecute this case to the fullest extent of federal law." Diana provided a detailed account of the morning's events, starting with her undercover approach to Blake's counter and ending with her wrongful arrest by airport police who had refused to investigate witness testimony or review available evidence. Vance listened with the focused attention of someone building a federal case, occasionally asking questions that clarified timeline details or legal elements that would be crucial for prosecution. "The passport destruction alone is a felony," Vance said after Diana had finished her account, examining the pieces of her ruined travel document that were now secured in evidence bags. But when you add the civil rights violations, the false accusations to law enforcement, and the systematic pattern of discrimination, we're looking at charges that could result in significant prison time. Blake Patterson sat in plastic handcuffs near the gate counter. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated as he watched federal agents document the scene of his crimes and interview passengers who had witnessed his behavior. Diana could see that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done, not just to her personally, but to his own future prospects in any career that required background checks or security clearances. Tiffany Rodriguez was speaking with an FBI agent about Blake's pattern of targeting certain passengers for hostile treatment, and her testimony was providing crucial corroboration of the complaints that had initially prompted Diana's undercover investigation. He always picked on people who looked like they wouldn't fight back, Tiffany said, her voice carrying the relief of someone who was finally able to speak freely about misconduct she had witnessed for months. The businessman who had recorded Blake's destruction of Diana's passport was transferring his video footage to FBI agents, and Diana could see additional passengers coming forward to provide statements about what they had witnessed. The documentation of Blake's crimes was becoming overwhelming, with multiple forms of evidence that would make prosecution straightforward and conviction virtually certain. Phoenix Airlines CEO Amanda Sterling arrived at Gate A7, looking like someone who had just learned that her company faced potential federal sanctions that could threaten their operating certificate at one of the nation's busiest airports. Diana watched Sterling assess the situation with the calculating expression of someone trying to determine how much damage control would be required to protect the company's reputation and financial stability. Inspector Washington Sterling said, as she approached Diana with the deferential manner of someone who understood that federal authority could ground her airline if mishandled. "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received from our employee. This behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent Phoenix Airlines' commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect." Diana studied Sterling with the clinical detachment she used when dealing with corporate executives who were more concerned with liability management than genuine reform. "Ms. Sterling, this investigation began because of multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment at this gate. Your employee's behavior today suggests a pattern that your company either didn't know about or chose to ignore." Sterling's expression shifted as she realized that Diana's investigation would extend far beyond Blake Patterson's individual misconduct to examine how Phoenix Airlines' policies, training, and oversight had allowed the pattern to develop and continue. "Inspector, we want to cooperate fully with your investigation and implement whatever reforms are necessary to ensure this never happens again." Diana nodded acknowledgement of Sterling's offer, while making it clear that corporate cooperation would be expected rather than appreciated. "Mrs. Sterling will be conducting a comprehensive audit of your company's passenger service policies, employee training programs, and complaint handling procedures. Any reforms will need to be court-supervised and subject to federal monitoring." Blake was being led away by FBI agents when he suddenly broke free from their escort and stumbled toward Diana with desperate energy, as if proximity to her might somehow undo the consequences of his actions. "Inspector Washington, please, you have to understand that I never meant for this to happen. I was just trying to do my job and I made a mistake. I'll do anything to make this right." Diana looked at Blake with an expression that mixed professional objectivity with personal disappointment at his continued refusal to accept responsibility for his choices. "Mr. Patterson, you didn't make a mistake. You made a series of deliberate decisions to target me for harassment because you thought I was powerless. The only thing you regret is getting caught." FBI agents restrained Blake as he continued trying to approach Diana, his pleas becoming increasingly frantic as he realized that his apologies would have no impact on the federal charges he was facing. "I didn't know you were an inspector. If I had known who you were, I never would have treated you that way. That's exactly the problem. Diana replied, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had heard every excuse that people offered when their prejudices led to criminal behavior. You only treat people with respect when you fear their authority. That attitude has no place in customer service or aviation safety. As Blake was finally led away from the gate area, Diana turned her attention to the broader implications of what had occurred, understanding that the case would ultimately serve as a precedent for how federal authorities responded to discrimination in transportation settings. The individual justice was important, but the systemic changes that would result from aggressive prosecution would protect countless future passengers from similar treatment. Marcus Vance approached Diana as the immediate crisis response wound down and the investigation entered its documentation phase. Diana, I know this was supposed to be a routine undercover audit, but what you've uncovered here is going to have implications far beyond one gate agent's misconduct. Are you prepared for the media attention and congressional interest this case is going to generate? Diana looked around, Gate A7, noting the passengers who were finally being allowed to board their flight, the airline personnel who were dealing with the reality that their workplace culture was under federal investigation, and the FBI agents who were still collecting evidence that would be used in court proceedings that could last for years. Marcus, I've been investigating aviation safety violations for 15 years, and I've never seen anything as blatant as what happened here today. If this case helps change how airlines treat passengers, then the personal cost will be worth it. The Phoenix Airlines corporate headquarters in Dallas erupted into crisis mode within hours of Diana Washington's revelation at Gate A7, with emergency meetings convening at every level of management as executives struggled to comprehend how a single gate agent's misconduct had evolved into a federal investigation that threatened the company's operating authority at major airports across the United States. CEO Amanda Sterling stood in the company's executive conference room surrounded by lawyers, public relations specialists, and senior vice presidents, whose faces reflected the dawning understanding that Blake Patterson's destruction of a federal inspector's passport represented only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of liability. The company's stock price had already begun declining as news of the incident spread through financial markets, and Sterling knew that worse publicity was inevitable once the full story became public. How did we not know about this pattern of complaints? Sterling asked her human resources director, whose uncomfortable shifting in his chair suggested that the answer would not provide comfort to anyone in the room. We have policies in place for documenting passenger service issues, and we conduct regular training on anti-discrimination measures. Diana's preliminary report delivered to Phoenix Airlines' legal department as a professional courtesy before formal charges were filed painted a devastating picture of corporate negligence that went far beyond Blake Patterson's individual misconduct. The investigation had uncovered 12 separate passenger complaints against Blake over the past 18 months, most of which had been dismissed or minimized by supervisors who viewed customer service disputes as inevitable rather than investigating whether patterns of discrimination might be emerging. General Counsel Michael Chen read portions of Diana's report aloud to the assembled executives, his voice growing more strained with each documented violation. Inspector Washington's findings suggest that Mr. Patterson was systematically targeting passengers based on racial profiling, economic assumptions, and perceived vulnerability to harassment. The complaints were buried in routine customer service files rather than being escalated for civil rights review. Sterling felt physically ill as she realized that her company had not only employed someone who was committing federal crimes on a daily basis, but had created an environment where his misconduct could continue unchecked because supervisors lacked training, motivation, or authority to address serious behavioral problems before they escalated to criminal violations. Meanwhile, Blake Patterson sat in a federal holding cell at the Chicago Metropolitan Correctional Center, his Phoenix Airlines uniform replaced by standard-issue detention clothing, as he waited for his initial court appearance on charges that carried potential prison sentences measured in years rather than months. The transformation from Gate A7's petty tyrant to federal defendant had occurred with stunning speed, leaving Blake struggling to process how his morning routine had led to criminal charges that would follow him for the rest of his life. Blake's court-appointed attorney had reviewed the evidence against him with the expression of someone calculating an impossible defense strategy. Understanding that the video documentation, witness testimony, and physical evidence of passport destruction created a case that prosecutors would win easily at trial. Blake, we need to discuss plea negotiations because fighting these charges would be professional suicide for both of us. The federal magistrate who conducted Blake's initial appearance treated the case with the seriousness that destruction of government property demanded, setting bail at $50,000. While noting that Blake's employment in aviation created flight risk concerns that would require supervision pending trial. Blake's girlfriend Amber had refused to post bail after learning about his arrest from news reports, and his parents had made it clear that their financial support would not extend to legal fees for civil rights violations. Back at O'Hare Airport, Tiffany Rodriguez was meeting with FBI agents who were documenting the hostile work environment that Blake had created for airline employees who might have challenged his behavior toward passengers. Her testimony revealed that Blake had consistently retaliated against co-workers who questioned his passenger service decisions, creating a culture of fear that prevented internal accountability. "I wanted to speak up so many times," Tiffany told the investigating agents, her voice carrying years of suppressed frustration at watching Blake abuse his authority. But he made it clear that contradicting him would result in negative performance reviews, schedule changes, and eventually termination. "I needed this job, and I couldn't risk my career to protect passengers I'd never see again." Diana Washington spent the afternoon working with federal prosecutors to ensure that the charges against Blake would reflect not only the specific crimes committed against her, but also the broader pattern of civil rights violations that had affected countless other passengers over the years. The case was being constructed as a precedent for how federal authorities would respond to transportation discrimination, with implications that extended far beyond individual prosecution. "We want to send a message that uniform authority doesn't provide immunity for violating civil rights," explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Kim as she reviewed the charges with Diana. Blake Patterson's case will demonstrate that customer service employees who target passengers based on race, economic status, or perceived vulnerability will face serious federal consequences. Phoenix Airlines' damage control efforts included immediate policy changes that would be implemented across their entire system. But Diana's investigation was expanding to examine whether the problems at Gate A7 reflected broader cultural issues within the company. Federal auditors were being dispatched to major Phoenix Airlines hubs to conduct surprise inspections of passenger service operations, and early reports suggested that Blake's misconduct was not an isolated incident. The media response to Blake's arrest was swift and comprehensive, with major news outlets picking up the story of a gate agent who had destroyed a federal inspector's passport during an undercover discrimination investigation. The businessman's cell phone video was broadcast repeatedly, showing Blake's deliberate destruction of Diana's travel document while passengers watched in horror, and the footage became a viral symbol of unchecked authority meeting inevitable consequences. Blake's social media accounts, which had previously showcased his gym workouts and expensive lifestyle, were flooded with comments from passengers who claimed to have experienced similar treatment at his gate over the years. The pattern that emerged from these testimonials painted a picture of someone who had used his position to humiliate and control travelers who couldn't fight back, with particular targeting of elderly passengers, families with children, and anyone whose appearance suggested economic vulnerability. Diana found herself at the center of congressional interest as representatives demanded hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation, with particular focus on how airline employees were trained, supervised, and held accountable for passenger service failures. Her case was being cited as evidence that stronger federal oversight was needed to protect travelers from the kind of abuse that Blake had made routine at Gate A7. The transformation was complete. Blake Patterson had begun the morning as the unchallenged king of his small domain, drunk on the power to control other people's travel plans and convinced that his uniform provided immunity from consequences. By evening, he was facing federal charges that would result in prison time, permanent disqualification from aviation employment, and financial liability that would follow him for decades. Diana Washington had achieved something more significant than individual justice for the treatment she had experienced. Her investigation had exposed systematic failures that allowed discrimination to flourish in one of the most regulated industries in America, and the reforms that would result from Blake's prosecution would protect countless future passengers from similar abuse. As federal agents completed their evidence collection at Gate A7 and Blake was processed through the criminal justice system that would determine his future, Diana reflected on the morning's events with the satisfaction of someone who had used her authority properly to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. The badge she wore represented responsibility rather than dominance, service rather than power, and justice rather than revenge. The king was dead, and his kingdom would be rebuilt on principles of dignity, respect, and equality that Blake Patterson had never understood or valued. The federal charges against him would serve as a permanent reminder that authority comes with accountability, and that treating people with cruelty while hiding behind a uniform will ultimately result in the complete destruction of everything the abuser thinks they've built. The Phoenix Airlines boardroom, 30 floors above downtown Dallas, felt like a bunker under siege as CEO Amanda Sterling faced a crisis that threatened not only her company's reputation, but its very survival as a major carrier with federal investigators circling like sharks who had scented blood in the corporate waters. The mahogany-paneled walls that usually projected authority and stability now seemed to close in on the executives who understood that Blake Patterson's misconduct had metastasized into an existential threat to their airline. Sterling stared at the bank of monitors displaying real-time financial data that told the story of corporate disaster in stark numerical terms. Phoenix Airlines stock had plummeted 18% in the 6 hours since news of Diana Washington's investigation had become public, wiping out nearly $400 million in market capitalization as investors fled from what analysts were calling a reputational death spiral. The Justice Department isn't just prosecuting Blake Patterson. General Counsel Michael Chen announced to the assembled executives, his voice carrying the gravity of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. They're launching a comprehensive civil rights investigation of our entire passenger service operation with particular focus on whether company policies and training contributed to discriminatory treatment of travelers. Sterling felt physically sick as she processed the implications of federal scrutiny that would extend far beyond the individual crimes committed at Gate A7. Understanding that Diana Washington's investigation had uncovered patterns of misconduct that suggested corporate negligence rather than isolated employee behavior. The preliminary findings included evidence that passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had been routinely dismissed or minimized by supervisors who lacked training in civil rights requirements. The company's head of human resources presented data that painted a devastating picture of institutional failure with statistics, showing that complaints against Blake Patterson had been filed by passengers whose demographic profiles revealed obvious patterns of racial and economic targeting. We received 14 formal complaints about Blake's behavior over the past 2 years. She admitted, her voice barely audible as she acknowledged the scope of management failures. Most were categorized as routine customer service disputes rather than potential civil rights violations. Sterling realized that Phoenix Airlines had not only employed someone who was committing federal crimes on a daily basis, but had created an organizational culture that enabled his misconduct by failing to recognize, investigate, or address obvious warning signs that should have triggered immediate intervention. The company's diversity training programs existed largely on paper with minimal enforcement and no meaningful accountability for employees who violated anti-discrimination policies. What's our exposure? Sterling asked her legal team, though she already suspected that the answer would be catastrophic enough to threaten the company's ability to continue operations at major airports where federal authorities controlled access and operating privileges. Civil rights violations in transportation carried financial penalties that could reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars, particularly when patterns of discrimination were documented across multiple incidents and locations. Chen consulted his notes with the expression of someone calculating damages that exceeded his ability to minimize or contain. The Justice Department can seek fines up to $10 million per violation, and they're treating each discriminatory incident as a separate offense. Diana Washington's investigation has already identified 43 potential violations over the past 3 years, and they're expanding the scope to include other airports where similar complaints have been filed. Sterling felt the walls closing in as she understood that Phoenix Airlines faced financial penalties that could exceed its annual profits, regulatory sanctions that could restrict its access to major airports, and civil lawsuits from passengers who had experienced discrimination similar to what Diana Washington had documented. The company's insurance policies excluded coverage for intentional civil rights violations, meaning that the full cost of Blake Patterson's misconduct would fall directly on shareholders and creditors. The Federal Aviation Administration had already initiated procedures to review Phoenix Airlines' operating certificate with particular focus on whether the company's passenger service failures created safety risks that justified restrictions on their flight operations. Diana Washington's position as a senior FAA inspector gave her findings special weight in regulatory proceedings, and her detailed documentation of Blake's behavior provided evidence that would be difficult for the airline to challenge or explain away. "We need to offer a settlement before this gets worse," Sterling announced, understanding that fighting federal civil rights charges would only increase the ultimate financial cost while generating additional negative publicity that could permanently damage the company's brand. "What would it take to resolve Diana Washington's individual case and demonstrate our commitment to reform?" Chen had anticipated the question and had already begun preliminary discussions with federal prosecutors about potential resolution frameworks that might limit Phoenix Airlines' exposure to criminal prosecution while addressing the civil rights violations that had been documented. Inspector Washington's legal team is seeking damages in the 8-figure range, plus court-supervised implementation of comprehensive anti-discrimination policies across our entire system. Sterling authorized settlement discussions that would ultimately result in Phoenix Airlines paying Diana Washington $12 million in compensatory and punitive damages, while agreeing to implement what became known as the Washington Protocols. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, independent monitoring of passenger complaint patterns, and financial penalties for supervisors who failed to address discriminatory behavior. The settlement announcement was carefully coordinated with a public apology from Sterling that acknowledged Phoenix Airlines' responsibility for creating an environment where Blake Patterson's misconduct could flourish unchecked, and the company's commitment to comprehensive reforms that would prevent similar violations in the future. The financial markets responded positively to the settlement, viewing it as a necessary step toward resolving an existential crisis that had threatened the airline's survival. But the individual settlement represented only the beginning of Phoenix Airlines' reckoning with the consequences of institutional discrimination, as federal investigators expanded their inquiry to examine whether similar patterns existed at other airports, whether company training programs adequately addressed civil rights requirements, and whether supervisory oversight was sufficient to prevent future violations. Diana Washington's case had exposed fundamental failures in how commercial airlines approached passenger service civil rights compliance and employee accountability, leading to industry-wide reforms that would affect how millions of travelers were treated by customer service representatives across the United States. The economic impact extended far beyond Phoenix Airlines to include additional training costs, enhanced monitoring systems, and liability insurance premiums that reflected the new reality of federal enforcement priorities. Blake Patterson's individual crimes had triggered consequences that reached from a single gate at O'Hare Airport to the highest levels of corporate governance and federal transportation policy, demonstrating that discrimination was not just morally wrong, but financially catastrophic for companies that failed to prevent and address civil rights violations by their employees. The message was clear: treating passengers with dignity and respect was not just the right thing to do, but the only way to avoid corporate destruction in an era of aggressive federal civil rights enforcement. Blake Patterson's fall from authority to federal defendant happened with the swift brutality of gravity, claiming someone who had convinced himself he could fly, and the 6 months following his arrest became a masterclass in how quickly a life built on unearned privilege and unchecked power could collapse into consequences that extended far beyond anything his imagination had prepared him to handle. The expensive downtown Chicago apartment that had stretched Blake's finances even when he was employed became impossible to maintain on unemployment benefits and the occasional day labor jobs that represented the only employment available to someone facing federal civil rights charges. His landlord had initiated eviction proceedings within 2 months of his arrest, and Blake found himself moving into a studio apartment in a neighborhood where his former passengers might have lived, experiencing economic vulnerability for the first time in his adult life. Amber had ended their 3-year relationship with a text message sent while Blake was meeting with his court-appointed attorney. Her message brief and final. "I can't be with someone who treats people the way you treated that woman. Don't contact me again." The breakup had been devastating, not just emotionally, but practically, as Blake had counted on Amber's financial support to help with legal expenses and basic living costs during his unemployment. Blake's family had disowned him with the cold finality that came from watching someone they had raised commit crimes that violated everything they claimed to believe about treating others with dignity and respect. His parents had released a public statement distancing themselves from his behavior and expressing support for Diana Washington, and his siblings had blocked his phone number and social media accounts to avoid association with his notoriety. The federal charges against Blake had been widely covered in local and national media, making him unemployable in any position that required background checks, customer interaction, or security clearances, which effectively eliminated most legitimate employment opportunities in the modern economy. The few employers who were willing to consider hiring him offered minimum wage positions with no benefits and no opportunity for advancement, a dramatic reversal from the authority and status he had enjoyed as a gate agent. Blake's court-appointed attorney had negotiated a plea agreement that would result in 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and permanent disqualification from any employment in aviation or transportation security. The federal judge who accepted the plea had noted that Blake's crimes represented a particularly serious violation of public trust, given that airline employees were responsible for passenger safety and civil rights compliance. The financial consequences of Blake's conviction extended far beyond his lost income to include restitution payments to Diana Washington, federal fines that would garnish his wages for the next decade, and civil liability for damages that could reach into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on additional lawsuits filed by passengers who had experienced similar treatment at his gate over the years. But the most devastating consequence for Blake was the psychological reckoning with his own behavior, and the realization that his entire adult identity had been built on a foundation of prejudice and power abuse that had ultimately destroyed everything he thought he had achieved. Court-mandated therapy sessions forced him to confront the reality that his treatment of Diana Washington had not been an isolated mistake, but the inevitable result of attitudes and beliefs that had shaped his interactions with vulnerable people for years. "You targeted Inspector Washington because you assumed she couldn't fight back," his therapist observed during one particularly difficult session, forcing Blake to acknowledge patterns of behavior that he had previously rationalized as professional firmness or necessary authority. "Your entire approach to customer service was based on dominating people you perceived as powerless." Blake's therapy sessions revealed the extent to which his need for control and dominance had poisoned not only his professional relationships, but his personal interactions with examples of similar behavior toward service workers, dating partners, and family members who had tolerated his attitudes because they hadn't understood the connection between personal prejudice and professional misconduct. The federal prison where Blake would serve his sentence was located in downstate Illinois, far from Chicago and the aviation industry where he had spent his adult career, and the inmates he would live alongside included people whose backgrounds and experiences challenged every assumption he had made about race, class, and character. Prison would become an involuntary education in humility, empathy, and the consequences of treating others without dignity or respect. During his final weeks of freedom before reporting to prison, Blake attempted to write letters of apology to Diana Washington and the passengers who had witnessed his behavior, but the attorneys handling his case advised him that such communications could be interpreted as attempts to influence potential witnesses rather than genuine expressions of remorse. Blake was forced to live with the knowledge that his victims would never receive acknowledgement of the harm he had caused them. The night before Blake reported to federal prison, he sat in his empty studio apartment surrounded by the few possessions he would be allowed to keep while serving his sentence, and reflected on the choices that had led him from a position of authority and respect to federal custody and permanent disgrace. The Phoenix Airlines uniform that had represented his identity and status was packed away in storage, a reminder of the person he had been before his prejudices had destroyed his life. Blake's story became a cautionary tale used in customer service training programs across the transportation industry, with his behavior serving as an example of how unchecked bias and abuse of authority could lead to career destruction, criminal prosecution, and personal ruin. The case was cited in federal civil rights enforcement materials as evidence that discrimination in commercial services carried serious consequences that extended far beyond workplace discipline. The transformation was complete. Blake Patterson had gone from believing he controlled other people's travel plans to having his own movements controlled by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, from wearing a uniform that commanded respect to wearing prison clothing that marked him as someone who had violated society's trust, and from making decisions about other people's lives to having every aspect of his own life determined by corrections officers and parole supervisors. The lesson was clear to anyone who cared to learn it. Authority is a privilege that comes with responsibility, and those who abuse their power over vulnerable people will ultimately discover that there are consequences more severe than anything their victims experienced. Consequences that follow them long after their uniforms have been taken away and their authority has been permanently revoked. 1 year after Blake Patterson's destruction of her passport at Gate A7, Diana Washington stood at the podium of the National Civil Rights Conference in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of federal officials, airline executives, and civil rights advocates who had gathered to hear her keynote address on dignity, authority, and the ongoing fight for equal treatment in American transportation systems. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity with representatives from every major airline, federal transportation officials, and members of Congress who had sponsored legislation requiring enhanced civil rights training for all customer-facing employees in transportation industries. Diana's case had become a catalyst for comprehensive reform that extended far beyond the aviation sector to include railways, bus systems, and other forms of commercial travel. True authority. Diana began her voice carrying the weight of experience and the clarity that comes from surviving injustice and transforming it into systematic change is not measured by your ability to humiliate others, but by your commitment to protecting their dignity even when no one is watching. The audience responded with sustained applause that reflected not only appreciation for her words, but recognition of the courage she had shown in documenting and prosecuting discrimination that many victims would have been unable to challenge. Diana's presentation included video footage from the businessman's cell phone recording of Blake's passport destruction, which had become one of the most viewed examples of workplace discrimination in social media history, generating over 50 million views and sparking conversations about implicit bias, power abuse, and accountability in customer service interactions across multiple industries. The Washington protocols that had emerged from Diana's case were now mandatory training requirements for more than 2 million transportation workers across the United States, with specific modules addressing racial bias, economic discrimination, and the proper handling of passenger complaints and conflicts. The training included role-playing exercises based on Diana's experience, forcing employees to confront their own assumptions about passenger profiles and service expectations. Tiffany Rodriguez, who had been promoted to senior gate supervisor at O'Hare after Blake's termination, joined Diana on stage to discuss the transformation of workplace culture that had occurred in the wake of the federal investigation. Inspector Washington's courage in documenting what happened didn't just change policies. Tiffany explained to the audience, it changed how we see each other as human beings deserving of respect, regardless of what we're wearing or how we look. Phoenix Airlines had become an industry leader in civil rights compliance, with their comprehensive anti-discrimination programs being adopted by competitors who recognized that the federal enforcement priorities demonstrated by Diana's case represented a new era of accountability for transportation providers. The company's stock price had not only recovered from the initial crisis, but had reached record highs as investors recognized that ethical business practices were increasingly important for long-term financial success. Blake Patterson had been released from federal prison after serving 16 months of his sentence, and was currently working at a homeless shelter in Chicago while completing his supervised probation requirements. His court-mandated community service involved helping other ex-offenders reintegrate into society, and his experience with the consequences of discrimination had transformed him into an advocate for the kind of civil rights training that might have prevented his own criminal behavior. Blake reached out to me 6 months ago. Diana revealed to the surprised audience, asking if he could contribute to discrimination prevention training by sharing his story with airline employees. I declined his offer not out of spite, but because I believe the focus should remain on protecting future victims rather than rehabilitating former perpetrators. Diana's daughter, Zara, had been accepted into the aviation management program at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, with plans to pursue a career in airline operations, with specific focus on passenger rights and service excellence. My mom showed me that real power comes from using your authority to lift others up rather than tear them down, Zara had written in her scholarship application essay, and I want to help build an aviation industry where every passenger is treated with the dignity my mother fought to protect. The federal investigation that had begun with Diana's undercover audit at Gate A7 had expanded to examine discrimination patterns at more than 40 airports across the United States, resulting in additional prosecutions, civil settlements, and policy reforms that had collectively changed how millions of Americans experienced commercial air travel. The economic impact of enhanced civil rights compliance was measured in billions of dollars of improved customer satisfaction, reduced legal liability, and increased market confidence in transportation providers. Diana concluded her keynote address with a reflection on the personal cost and public benefit of her decision to maintain her undercover status despite Blake's escalating abuse, understanding that her willingness to experience injustice had been necessary to document it in ways that would create lasting change for future travelers. I could have ended Blake Patterson's harassment by showing my badge at any point during our confrontation, Diana told the audience, but doing so would have protected only me while leaving his pattern of discrimination intact for the next passenger who couldn't defend themselves. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is allow people to show us who they really are when they think no one important is watching. The standing ovation that followed Diana's remarks lasted for several minutes, with audience members understanding that they were applauding not just her individual courage, but the principle that authority should serve justice rather than personal convenience, that dignity should be protected regardless of economic status or racial identity, and that real change requires people with power to use it on behalf of those who have been denied equal treatment. Diana Washington had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a movement for institutional reform, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding injustice, but from experiencing it fully, documenting it carefully, and using the evidence to ensure that future victims would be protected by systems that prioritized their rights over the convenience of those who would deny them. 3 years later, Diana Washington's badge opened doors not through fear, but through the respect earned by someone who had proven that federal authority existed to protect the vulnerable rather than punish them. Blake Patterson worked quietly at community reintegration programs, his story serving as a permanent reminder that prejudice carries consequences that extend far beyond its immediate victims. The aviation industry had been fundamentally transformed by what became known as the Gate A7 standard, the principle that every passenger interaction should be conducted with the assumption that dignity matters more than authority, that service excellence requires treating people as individuals rather than stereotypes, and that real professionalism means protecting rather than exploiting those who depend on your cooperation. Diana's legacy lived in the millions of travelers who would never experience the discrimination she had endured because her willingness to document injustice had created systems that prevented it. The badge she wore represented not just federal authority, but the promise that America's transportation systems would serve all citizens with equal respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived ability to demand better treatment.